It didn't feel like a mistake when you made it. That's the part that's easy to forget at the time. It made sense, not vaguely, not emotionally clearly. You had your reasons, you thought it through, you moved forward without hesitation, and for a moment there was no tension in it, no signal that something was off, no quiet resistance in the back of your mind. It just fit, and that's where it starts. Because if it was wrong, why didn't it feel wrong? You don't usually make decisions in confusion. That's the assumption people carry, that bad decisions come from chaos, from lack of thinking, from not knowing, but most of the time, you're not confused at all. You certain, quietly certain, certain enough to act certain enough to commit certain enough to believe you understand what's happening, and that certainty feels like awareness. But awareness isn't completed, never is. It comes in layers, and most decisions are made before those layers fully surface. You see part of the situation, you feel part of the truth, you understand just enough to move forward without friction, and because there's no friction, it feels complete. That's the illusion, because nothing in that moment tells you you're only seeing part of it. There's no indicator for missing context, no signal for incomplete perception, just clarity, or something that feels exactly like it, and clarity is convincing. It doesn't ask questions, doesn't hesitate, it moves, so the decision happens not slowly, not carefully, but naturally, as if it was always going to happen that way. And when you look back later, it's hard to understand why, because later you see more, but in the moment you weren't missing something obvious, you were missing something invisible. That's the difference, because what drives your decisions isn't just what's in front of you, it's everything behind it, what you've learned to notice, what you've learned to ignore, what feels familiar, what feels consistent with who you think you are. And all of that operates quietly before the decision feels like a decision. So when you say, "I knew what I was doing," you're not wrong. You did know something, you just didn't know everything. And the part you didn't know didn't feel missing. That's what makes it dangerous, because missing information doesn't feel like a gap, it feels like certainty. Think about how quickly some decisions happen. You meet someone, and something about them just works. You don't question it, you don't slow it down, you don't dissect every detail. You trust the feeling because it feels familiar, and familiarity is powerful. It doesn't feel like recognition, it feels like understanding. But familiarity isn't clarity, it's repetition. It's your mind recognizing a pattern it's already comfortable with, not necessarily one that's accurate, just one that's consistent. So the decision gets made not because you fully understand the situation, but because it aligns with something you already believe. And alignment feels like truth, even when it isn't. That's how the pattern begins, because decisions don't exist in isolation. They connect quietly over time. You notice something, interpret it, you act on that interpretation, and if nothing immediately contradicts it, it gets reinforced. That reinforcement matters more than the outcome, because the outcome can be ignored, reprimanded away, but the interpretation, that stays. So the next time something similar happens, you don't start fresh, you start from what you already believe, and that belief feels earned because it's been repeated. So your awareness doesn't expand, it narrows. It becomes more efficient, faster, more automatic, more certain, but not more complete. That's where it shifts, because now you're not making decisions based on what you see, or making them based on how you've learned to see, and that difference is subtle, almost invisible, but it changes everything. Because once a pattern is reinforced, it stops feeling like a pattern. It starts feeling like identity, not just something you do, but something that makes sense for you to do. So when you make the same kind of decision again, it doesn't feel repetitive, it feels consistent, and consistency feels correct, even when it leads to the same outcome. That's where partial awareness becomes difficult to detect, because nothing feels incomplete. There's no obvious gap, no missing piece you can point to, just a sense that this is how I think, this is how I decide, this is what makes sense. And once it reaches that point, questioning the decision starts to feel like questioning yourself, and that's where resistance appears, because identity protects itself, not aggressively, quietly. When something doesn't line up, you don't immediately reject the decision, you adjust the meaning, you explain it, you rationalize it, you reshape the story just enough to keep everything intact, because breaking the pattern means admitting something wasn't fully seen, and that's uncomfortable. So the cycle continues. The Same type of decision, the same reasoning, the same outcome that almost makes sense, but never fully, and each time, it still feels like you're choosing. That's the part that hides it because you are choosing you. Not being forced, you are not unaware or just partially aware, and partial awareness feels complete. That's the trap because when you look back later when something no longer makes sense, it feels like the decision came out of nowhere, like you missed something obvious, but you didn't miss something obvious, you missed something you weren't able to see at that level of awareness. It didn't exist. Not clearly, not fully, not in a way that could interrupt the decision, and by the time it becomes visible, the decision is already behind you, so you try to reconstruct it. You replay the moment, you revisit the reasoning, you search for the point where it went wrong. But the moment itself wasn't broken, it was built on something incomplete, a version of reality that felt whole but wasn't, and that realization doesn't arrive all at once. It comes slowly, a detail that doesn't fit, a reaction that feels familiar in a different way, a pattern that starts repeating too precisely until eventually something doesn't hold together anymore. That's the fracture, not when the decision was made, not when the outcome appeared, but when your interpretation can support everything you're seeing. That's when awareness shifts, not because something new happened, but because you're finally seeing what was already there, and suddenly the same decision looks different, not wrong, incomplete, and that changes how you understand it, because now you can see the parts that weren't visible before, the assumptions, the patterns, the quiet influences shaping everything, and you start to realize you weren't making a random decision, you were making a consistent one, consistent with how you interpret things, consistent with what feels familiar, consistent with the level of awareness you had at the time, and that level was never complete, but it felt like it was. That's why it's so difficult to catch, because nothing feels missing while it's happening, nothing feels uncertain, nothing suggests you're only seeing part of it. It just feels like clarity, and clarity moves quickly, so the next decision comes and it feels just as clear, just as reasonable, just as aligned, and the cycle continues. Not because you refuse to learn, not because you ignore reality, but because what you learned was built on partial awareness, and partial awareness doesn't correct itself. It stabilizes it, reinforces its own logic until something forces a shift. Even then, it doesn't fully resolve because you're still making decisions, now still interpreting, still choosing, still operating from a level of awareness that feels complete, but isn't, and it won't feel incomplete until later. That's the quiet pattern underneath everything. You don't repeat decisions because you don't learn, you repeat them because what you learned was never fully visible, and what isn't fully visible feels correct. That's why it's hard to stop. That's why it keeps happening. It didn't feel wrong when you made it, and if it feels right again, you'll probably make it again before you see what's missing, and by the time you do, you're already past the moment where it could have changed anything. That's how it moves quietly, and that's why it's so hard to catch, because while it's happening, it doesn't feel incomplete. It feels like you understand. That's what makes it convincing, and that's what makes it repeat. It didn't feel wrong. That's why it kept happening.